Mary Seacole. The 23rd of November 1805, the 14th of May 1881. British Jamaican nurse responsible for nursing hundreds of British soldiers back to health during the Crimean War. Seacole was a pioneering nurse and heroine of the Crimean War, who as a woman of mixed race overcame a double prejudice. Mary Jane Grant was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1805. Her father was a Scottish soldier, and her mother a Jamaican. Mary learned her nursing skills from her mother, who kept a boarding house for invalid soldiers. Although technically free, being of mixed race, Mary and her family had few civil rights. They could not vote, hold public office or enter the professions. In 1836, Mary married Edwin Seacole, but the marriage was short-lived as he died in 1844. Seacole was an inveterate traveler, and before her marriage visited other parts of the Caribbean, including Cuba, Haiti and the Bahamas, as well as Central America and Britain. On these trips she complemented her knowledge of traditional medicine with European medical ideas. In 1854, Seacole traveled to England again, and approached the War Office, asking to be sent as an army nurse to the Crimea, where there was known to be poor medical facilities for wounded soldiers. She was refused. Undaunted, Seacole funded her own trip to the Crimea, where she established the British Hotel near Balaclava to provide a mess table and comfortable quarters for sick and convalescent officers. She also visited the battlefield, sometimes under fire, to nurse the wounded, and became known as Mother Seacole. Her reputation rivaled that of Florence Nightingale. After the war she returned to England destitute and in ill health. The press highlighted her plight, and in July 1857 a benefit festival was organized to raise money for her, attracting thousands of people. Later that year, Seacole published her memoirs, The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. Seacole died on the 14th of May, 1881. Mary Seacole was born in Kingston, Jamaica, on the 23rd of November, 1805. Her father was a Scottish soldier and her mother was Jamaican. Seacole was born at a time when many black people in the Caribbean were forced to work as slaves, but as Seacole was mixed race, she was born a free person. Seacole's mother was a healer who used traditional Caribbean and African medicine to treat people, teaching many of these skills to her daughter. By the age of 12, Seacole was helping her mother run a boarding house in Kingston, where many of the guests were injured soldiers. She even used to practice medicine on her dolls and pets, before working alongside her mother. In 1823, Seacole traveled first to London and later, in 1825, to the Bahamas, Haiti and Cuba, before returning to Jamaica in 1826. She became one of the first to recognize and practice modern nursing skills, despite her lack of formal education, including the use of hygiene, ventilation, hydration and rest. Seacole's mother and other Jamaican nurses were practicing the use of good hygiene almost a century before Florence Nightingale wrote about its importance. During the 19th century, large numbers of British troops arrived in the West Indies and were often infected by unfamiliar tropical diseases like yellow fever. Seacole combined her knowledge of traditional West Indian medicine with newer modern medicine, learned from military doctors, and began to experiment with different techniques. She used various remedies, such as mustard emetics to induce vomiting and pomegranate juice to treat diarrhea. In 1850, Seacole nursed people during a cholera epidemic in Jamaica and Panama. The epidemic killed as many as 40,000 people in Jamaica, 10% of the island's population at the time. Following her time in Panama, Seacole returned to Kingston in 1853. After the outbreak of the Crimean War, Seacole returned to London to offer her services to the British Army, but there was considerable prejudice against women in medicine and her application was rejected by the British War Office. Undeterred, Seacole funded her own trip to Crimea and established a hotel to provide a place for sick and recovering soldiers just as her mother had. As well as tending to men in her hotel, Seacole rode on horseback into the battlefields to nurse wounded soldiers on the front lines. Her immense hospitality was tenderly remembered by soldiers on both sides of the war and she became known as Mother Seacole. Returning to England once the Crimean War had ended, many of the British soldiers Seacole treated wrote letters to local newspapers praising her work. In 1857, a fundraising gala was held in her name on the River Thames. Over 80,000 people attended. That same year, she also published her autobiography, The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. Seacole died in London on the 14th of May, 1881 from internal bleeding. Although she was well known towards the end of her life, she later became a lost figure in history for over a century. However, in the early 2000s, nurses from the Caribbean revisited her grave in London and brought her back into the limelight. In 2016, a statue of Seacole was erected in the grounds of London's St. Thomas Hospital. Seacole continues to be a role model for many young nurses and health professionals, who praise her hospitality and selflessness. In 2004, more than 10,000 people voted her the Greatest Black Briton. Key facts. Full name, Mary Jane Seacole. Born, the 23rd of November, 1805, Kingston, Jamaica. Died, the 14th of May, 1881, London, aged 75. Mary Seacole was a British Jamaican nurse famous for nursing hundreds of British soldiers back to health during the cholera pandemic of 1850 and, later, the Crimean War. Careful examination of primary sources, notably digitized newspaper sources, British, Australian and New Zealand, show that the claims for Seacole's global influence in nursing do not hold, while her use of practice-based evidence might better be called self-assessment. Primary sources, moreover, show substantial evidence of Nightingale's contributions to nursing and healthcare, in Australia, New Zealand, the USA and many countries and the UK. Much material shows her influence also on hospital safety and health promotion. Introduction. The purpose of the author of this section was to challenge the presentation of Mary Seacole, 1805-1881, as a nurse of global influence and significance. That she was a remarkable person who deserves honoring is not in question, but it is questionable that her accomplishments match those of Florence Nightingale, 1820-1910. Both of these women became known during the Crimean War, 1854-1856, but Seacole's renown was mainly for her business in the Crimea, whose customers were officers. She received ongoing, sympathetic coverage for her bankruptcy and her fine memoir Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, 1857 received favourable coverage, in Australia and New Zealand and Britain, however, never as a source on nursing or healthcare. Nightingale, by contrast, became famous for her work in the Crimean War, her vigorous championing of better conditions for the soldiers, her detailed research on what went wrong at the war hospitals and how to improve them, to her founding of a nursing school and decades of work mentoring nurses, facilitating the introduction of nursing in many countries and making hospitals safer. Typical presentations today of Nightingale and Seacole go well beyond ordinary revisionism in history. Revisionism is appropriate and indeed welcome, when new material comes to light, or new concerns, such as with the extension of human rights to previously excluded or discriminated against groups. Yet revisionist authors must also respect sources, giving precedence to reliable primary sources. Secondary sources must be carefully scrutinized, especially in a field when so many have been shown to be faulty, that is, when their claims are examined against primary sources. In the case of Seacole, 10 common myths about her achievements have been challenged with solid primary sources, MacDonald 2013, yet the claims continue to be made as if they were credible. Mary Seacole is of interest in the UK primarily for her time in the Crimean War. Many myths have been articulated as to how she got there, which usually blame government departments for prejudice, in some cases the head of the nursing team, Florence Nightingale. The authentic story, using Seacole's own memoir and records from the time, is more prosaic. At the start of the Crimean War she was in London attending to her gold mining stocks, having gone there from Panama, where she had a business provisioning men en route to the California gold rush. After several months of futile efforts, she decided to seek a position as an army nurse, aware that Nightingale and her team had already left. Seacole 1857 BP 78. She sought to join the second team, but it had either left, or was about to leave. Her own memoir specifies that she did not decide to try to go until after learning of the sinking of a major supply ship, Seacole P-74, news of which was first published in England on the 30th of November, 1854, The Times 1854. She never submitted the required written application with references, but dropped in informally to various government and war-related offices. But too late, Seacole pp 76-79. She arrived in the Crimea in March or April, or possibly later, in 1855. Let's delve into some of the degrading insults used to describe her efforts to save Britain and its soldiers. The Crimean War, Seacole and Nightingale compared. When Seacole arrived in the Crimea, she set up a business in a hut, popularly known as Mrs. Seacole's, which was a restaurant/bar/store/takeaway/catering service for officers, with a canteen for the soldiery. While getting her business ready to open, she kindly gave out hot tea and lemonade to soldiers waiting on the wharf for transport to the general hospitals. All the doctors would allow me to give. She made her herbal remedies available to all, but the ingredients were unspecified. Her memoir gives 3 full chapters, 13, 14 and 18, to the meals, catering and services she provided to officers, while there is only passing mention of soldiers, but no details of what she provided for them. In her memoir, Seacole described precisely 3 occasions when she gave assistance on the battlefield: post-battle, the 18th of June, 2016, August and the 8th of September, 1855, Seacole pp 15561, 16467 and 16972. Yet this is frequently made out to be a regular occurrence. A book by nurses, for example, states that she frequently ventured out onto the battlefield, selling goods and caring for wounded soldiers from both sides. McAllister and Lowe 2011 p. 26. A book for school children describes her main job as searching the battlefields for wounded and dying men, even while the guns were still firing. Castor 1999, p. 34. An encyclopedia entry has her caring for British soldiers at the battlefront, and a familiar figure transferring casualties from the front, for which she won decorations from 3 countries. Encyclopedia Britannica 2014. Both Seacole personally and her business got favourable newspaper coverage in The Times and other newspapers. Many more examples have been added from provincial newspaper archives. Staring Dirksit al. 2015. The first 2 authors are ambassadors for the Seacole Statue campaign, the third its vice-chair. These authors, however, draw inferences from the coverage that do not survive scrutiny of the sources themselves, nor of other available sources from the time. Most of the items on Seacole retrieved are mere passing mentions, with no content on nursing, hospitals or health care. That Seacole and her assistant were among the first settlers in the purveying line was noted in an Australian newspaper story. The commanders-in-chief of the British and French armies, Codrington and Pelissier, were said to have been seen in her establishment, also Billy Russell, the war correspondent W.H. Russell, and every officer of the 3 armies. Sydney Morning Herald 1856. This is business and socializing, not the running of a hospital for ordinary soldiers. Seacole was noted as being present for the awarding of the Order of the Bath to senior officers, and that she was introduced to the official who made the presentations on behalf of the Queen, Lord Gough. Daily News 1856b. She recorded the event in her own memoir, adding that she sent a cake to army headquarters for it, decorated with banners, flags, etc. Seacole p. 169. Lord Gough, on the other hand, made a point of calling on Nightingale at her hospital. Rate 1903 Volume 2, p. 335. Some of the newspaper items simply refer to the location of her hut, a known landmark, for example, that a stone struck her door, which is 3.5 or 4 miles from the park, The Times 1855c, and that there was a police station nearby, The Times 1855e. Other mentions are of her catering, for example, that she was the only woman at the horse races, where she presided over a sorely invested tent full of creature comforts, The Times 1855d. The world's first war correspondent, W.H. Russell, was a customer at Mrs. Seacole's, liked her and paid tribute to her kindness to the soldiers. He recounted spotting her on the battlefield, when he was there interviewing soldiers, The Times 1855b. Seacole quoted his compliments in her memoir, Seacole pp 1712, for which he also wrote a warm introduction. All this is to Seacole's credit, but repetition of his praise does not make her battlefield visits more frequent or make her into a battlefield nurse. In the 4 volumes of Russell's dispatches published later, Seacole appears only once, briefly, Russell 1856 pp 1878. When he returned to the Crimea in 1869, escorting the Prince and Princess of Wales on a state visit, their carriages passed near the site of Mother Seacole's, Russell 1869 p. 564. A review of a book recounting another return visit noted the heaps of broken bottles by Mrs. Seacole's store, The Times 1869a. Russell's mentions of Nightingale, by contrast, are frequent, many of them in considerable detail. His dispatches, as the Times coverage generally, relate the terrible conditions she and her nurses faced and her use of the Times fund to purchase desperately needed clothing, bedding, supplies, food, etc., for the hospitals. Many stories describe the failings of the War Office which Nightingale had to overcome. The Times also printed letters from her and many more about her, from people at the war. A count of mentions in the Times shows more than 7 for Nightingale for every one of Seacole. Seacole's own account of her trip to and time spent in the Crimea are largely of her business, its challenges and the officers it served. Newspaper coverage of her activities similarly was largely of the business and its various problems. A short item announced her intended hotel for excursion visitors, The Times 1855a. An American newspaper story described her hotel for travelers, with the reporter's promise to board with her next year, New York Daily Tribune 1855. At the first British assault on the Redan, she sold food and drink to spectators, then gave first aid, Seacole p. 157. On her second foray onto the battlefield, she gave first aid after selling goods to spectators, Seacole pp. 1647. Seacole is noted, in a memoir, for providing lunch for a cricket match, Astley 1894, p. 145. Her third and last foray onto the battlefield all were post-battle took place at the second failed British attempt on the Redan, Seacole pp. 16972. For New Year's Day of 1856 she held a party and took plum pudding and mince pies to the nearby Land Transport Corps Hospital, Seacole p. 187. In April 1856, the fighting by then long over, Seacole went out on excursions to see the Crimean countryside. A newspaper story recounts Russian soldiers giving her a religious medallion, Aberdeen Journal 1856. In May 1856, a newspaper story reports that she made a grand tour in the Crimea, that she was able to leave some stock behind her and that she was given a medal by the Sultan. The Times 1856b. Possibly this is a reference to the religious medallion above noted. In June 1856, when troops were leaving the Crimea, she was cheered by soldiers as they passed by her hut. The Times 1856c. A newspaper story in July 1856, as she was leaving the Crimea, said that she planned to establish a store at Aldershot, a British Army base. The Times 1856d. She was seen by an Australian fellow passenger on board the Indus, which sailed from Constantinople to Marseilles, August 1857a. Coverage of Nightingale's work during the war was extensive and favourable. In the Times alone there were over 200 stories or letters on her over the course of the war. The early stories reported her departure, then the terrible conditions the nurses faced at the barrack hospital, the lack of bedding, clothing and supplies, overcrowding and poor nutrition, with much on her use of the Times fund and other donations to meet needs. Coverage in 1855 moved on to Nightingale's trips to the Crimea and its hospitals, her illness, convalescence and return to work. There was much coverage of the improvement in hospital conditions, the work of the sanitary and supply commissions, with Nightingale's assistance. She was much cited in hearings in London of the Roebuck Select Committee investigating the state of the army, reported in the Times and in papers in Melbourne, Age 1855, Sydney, Empire 1855, Sydney Morning Herald 1855, and Adelaide, South Australian Register 1855. Stories in 1856 took up improved conditions for soldiers, with the establishment of the Inkerman Cafe and reading rooms, then plans for her return to England and her first work back home to address the problems. There are letters by Nightingale to the editor and some to family members they sent on to a paper. She was frequently mentioned in letters to the editor by people who had visited the war hospitals. Post-Crimea, Seacole and Nightingale compared. Back home, Seacole continued to get good coverage, as a minor celebrity, not as a nurse or healthcare expert. Her bankruptcy hearings were extensively reported, always with great sympathy. That she wore 4 medals at the first hearing was noted, but not questioned. The Times 1856i. The humour magazine Punch published a cartoon in support of fundraising for her, Punch 1856. Another cartoon showed her distributing copies of Punch, donated by officers, to men in the local hospital. The article accompanying the cartoon related her difficult but not desperate, financial situation, Punch 1857. A filly named Mrs. Seacole won a race held at the garrison at Woolwich, The Times 1856 G. Numerous banquets took place on the return of the army. Newspaper sources show that Seacole was present at two of them, The Times 1856 EF. In addition to the well-known Surrey Gardens Festival held in her honour in July 1857, fundraisers were held for her in Australia and New Zealand, August 1856. The situation is different for Nightingale, who attended no crimey and banquets or fundraisers. Claiming she had only been in Mother Seacole's training, however, she was toasted and commended at many, for example, in the Edinburgh toast to the British Army, the Navy, our allies, the memory of those who fell and Florence Nightingale, which was followed by a lengthy description of her work by Sir John McNeill, The Times 1856 H. She was toasted also in banquets in London, Hereford, Leeds, Portsmouth, Ledbury and Greenock. Further afield she was toasted in Dublin, Paris, Calcutta, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Auckland and Hobart, Tasmania. In Paris, fundraising was organised for all British residents on the continent, The Times 1856A. Visits to naval bases, by Nightingale and Seacole 1857B and 1859. Both Nightingale and Seacole visited naval bases post-Crimea, Nightingale twice in 1857, Seacole once in 1859, but with greatly different purposes and results. Nightingale's first trip was to Haslar, which took more than a day. The second was to the large Melville Hospital, with its dispensing rooms, wash houses, receiving rooms, and Fort Pitt General Hospital. On both trips she was escorted by Sir John Liddell, the Director General of the Medical Department of the Navy. Both visits were reported in detail, the first as follows. They made a minute inspection of the whole establishment, with the organisation of which Miss Nightingale was pleased to express her entire approval. They left yesterday morning for Portsmouth, to visit the military hospital there. At the latter establishment, Miss Nightingale was received by Dr. Bell, medical inspector and principal officer, with the medical staff, who conducted her through the several wards, the cookhouse, Mildan ward and the 20th, 22nd and 97th Regimental Hospitals, under the same roof, concluding with a visit to the Royal Ordnance Hospital. Both at Haslar and at Portsmouth, Miss Nightingale recognised several of the patients and the medical officers, with whom she chatted freely. After a minute inspection of the Portsmouth Hospital and its dependencies, the ladies returned to London by an early train, The Times 1857A. Her Chatham visit a few months later was similarly reported, the purpose again noted as the inspection of its several naval and military hospitals, where there were upwards of 500 patients. Miss Nightingale first inspected the garrison hospital at Chatham Barracks. After spending some time in visiting the several wards, in which there are about 300 patients, the party proceeded to Melville Hospital. This large establishment, which adjoins Chatham Dockyard, is used solely for patients belonging to the Navy and the Royal Marines and, in consequence of its proximity to the two large naval establishments at Chatham and Sheerness, wards are generally all occupied. The number of patients now in that hospital is upwards of 200, during her inspection of this hospital, which occupied upwards of 2 hours. Miss Nightingale frequently expressed her approval of the excellent arrangements adopted for the comfort of the patients. She was much pleased with the size of the wards, which are commodious, light and well ventilated. Each patient, it was found on enquiry, having 1,200 cubic feet of space, The Times 1857b. Nightingale's views of Melville Hospital were later recounted with pride by the First Lord of the Admiralty, that she had judged it to be one of the most perfect and best arranged establishments, The Times 1864c. Mrs. Seacole's visits, on the other hand, were purely social. They show that she was fondly remembered, but give no evidence of nursing or hospital work. A newspaper story reported her visits to several of the military and naval bases doing duty at Sheerness, with her plans for further visits. Her Crimean celebrity was noted, with the hearty and kind welcome from the garrison officers whose quarters she made her home during her stay. On her visit to Chatham Barracks and Melville Hospital, she was received with the best feelings by the officers and men. Many of the heroes of the Crimea surrounded her and cheered her enthusiastically. Daily News 1859. The Turkish Mecidi Medal, evidence for and against its award to Seacole. The claim has often been made that Seacole won 4 medals. Many books for school children portray her wearing them: Huntley 1993, Moorcroft and Magnuson 1998, Mallam 1999, Williams 2003, 2009, Ridley 2009. That the Institute of Jamaica owns the Mijidi and the Legion of Honor is sometimes cited as evidence for their having been awarded to her, but the Institute acknowledges its total lack of documentation as to their provenance. Greenland 2012, MacDonald 2014, p. 158. More recently, newspaper archives have been said to provide new evidence that Seacole won at least the Turkish Mijidi medal, starring Dirksit al 2015, p. 517. The sources they cite, however, lack specifics. The Daily News stated that the Turkish government has given Mrs. Seacole, of Balaclava, a medal for her services, and then suggested that no doubt a Crimean medal with the Sebastopol clasp would be well bestowed on her. Daily News 1856a. No date of award or award ceremony is mentioned in any of these sources. Moreover, since the Mijidi was, in effect, British military medal, nominations were made by senior army officers. Seacole would not have been eligible. Nor was she eligible for the Crimean medal at all, let alone the Sebastopol clasp, for which service throughout the siege was required. She missed the first half of it. 11 other provincial newspapers are cited in support of the Mijidi claim, starring Dirksit al 2015, p. 518, but again not one provided any concrete details. Given Seacole's published views of Turks, one might wonder why the Turkish government would award her a medal at all. The commander Omar Pasha was a customer for her bottled beer, cherry and champagne, Seacole p. 110. Yet she looked down on ordinary Turks, the degenerate descendants of the fierce Arabs, for lacking in pluck, p. 106. While they were not as dishonest as the French or Greeks, p. 111, she wrote, they were deliberate, slow and indolent, given to the sacred duties of eating and praying and getting into out-of-the-way corners at all times of the day to smoke themselves to sleep, p. 109. Seacole wore 3 medals, but not the Mijidi, for her portrait by Chalin and her photograph by Moore. If she had won any medals, it is likely that she would have worn them. However, the evidence is unequivocal that she did not win the Crimean, Mayo 1897. For the French medal, information was received from the Musée de la Légion d'Honneur, that no trace of a nomination in her name could be found, Minjolit 2012. A major biographer looked unsuccessfully in War Office records for evidence of medals, Robinson 2005, p. 167. Another author pointed out that the 3 medals Seacole wore for the Chalin portrait were unquestionably hanging from incorrect ribbons, Rappaport 2005, p. 62. Tellingly, Seacole wore no medals in her portrait on the cover of her memoir, nor, in the text, did she claim to have won any. If she had won so much as one, this would have made history the first woman to be so honored. Nightingale won no medals. She was not eligible either, but the Queen sent her a brooch in lieu of a medal. It is known that Seacole wore medals, varying numbers of them, while out walking in London. An assistant surgeon who knew her saw her in Charing Cross wearing the Crimean medal, read 1911, p. 13. He, not so incidentally, praised her for her kindness in giving hot tea to soldiers waiting on the Balaclava wharf for transport, but he never called her a nurse or a doctor. He described her store at Kadaikoi, near Balaclava, where she sold all sorts of commodities, clothing and articles of food that were luxuries to us, read 1911, p. 14. It seems that Seacole did not wear medals at the Surrey Gardens events, or they likely would have been mentioned in the extensive coverage given them. At one, she is noted to have been seated next to Lord Rokeby, Standard 1857, who would have known that they could not have been hers. She was wearing all her decorations when she arrived in Antwerp in 1858, but then that article also called her a companion of Nightingale and gave her the title of Lady Seacole, Morning Chronicle 1858. The final point on the medals issue is Seacole's failure to mention any in her will. She made detailed dispositions of her goods, the diamond ring of her late husband, her own jewelry, watch, trinkets, ornaments, furniture, pictures, prints, engravings, plate, linen, china and household effects, Leeds Probate Office 1881. Why no medals if she had won any? The answer to that would lie in the people at the probate office, where maybe her updated will was never brought forward, or the war office that told her she was not wanted, or the person or persons that hit her with that brick that caused her to die from internal bleeding, or in the people that place a lot of effort in her story not being told in its true format, as this was at a time when black people had no right to their own creations. Nursing in the Indian Mutiny. Many authors have told the story of Seacole's interest in going to nurse in the Indian Mutiny. Starring Dirks et al., 2015, pp 51920, additionally, claim that recently discovered newspaper stories give greater credence to the possibility. Certainly they uncovered many articles with that suggestion, but the timing does not work. The first violence occurred in March 1857, the first murders of British nationals in May. Yet in a letter to the editor of Punch magazine, dated the 8th of May, 1857, Seacole expressed an interest in going to China, or some other shore to which Englishmen go to serve their country, and the purpose was not specifically nursing, but women's work. India is not mentioned, Punch 1857. A brief note otherwise covering the Surrey Gardens Festival describes Seacole telling the Secretary of State for War of her desire to go to India during the mutiny, Times 1857 c. Another newspaper reported a former Nightingale associate offering to the East India Company, which then administered India, to take nurses. It is dated the 18th of July, 1857, and the company's answer the 22nd of August, 1857, which stated that no women nurses were wanted, Daily News 1857. Thus, one wonders what Seacole had in mind when, in October 1857, she wrote to the military secretary at the War Office, Sir Henry Stokes, asking him to forward a letter, contents unknown, to the War Secretary. If it were an offer, it was late. Yet it has been cited as evidence of Seacole's networking skills, Starring Dirks et al. 2015, p. 514. It seems rather to demonstrate lack of practical knowledge of conditions in India and the time it would take to get there. Let's listen to the subliminal racist reviews of her memoirs. Seacole's Wonderful Adventures. Seacole published her famous memoir, Seacole 1857b, largely motivated by the need to make money. The Surrey Gardens fundraisers in July 1856 did not yield much, after expenses were paid. The book was successful and was promptly reprinted when it sold out. It was soon translated into Dutch, Seacole 1857a, and then French, Seacole 1858. Starring Dirks et al. Found 26 reviews, 2015, p. 518. One not on their list praised the book, calling its author an itinerant licensed victualler and a jolly old soul, who had not written a line of it. Still, she deserved credit, for it was her life. The little volume would give a couple of hours amusement. Critic 1857. Some of the provincial newspaper reviews are brief, a bare sentence for one. We learn from Mrs. Seacole's memoirs that the good lady is a native of Jamaica, her father being a Scotchman and her mother a Creole, that she married Mr. Seacole, who was of weak health and soon died, and afterwards she went to Panama and set up an inn there. Ultimately she found her way to Balaclava, Lancaster Gazette 1857. Most of the reviews give excerpts, some numerous, evidently chosen for their dramatic appeal. A lengthy review in an Australian newspaper, which also urged readers to contribute to the Seacole Fund, was rife with errors of fact. It called war correspondent W. H. Russell Dr. Russell, Illawarra Mercury 1857, an error that would appear again in obituaries for Seacole, beginning with the Times, 1881a. A Sydney newspaper gave a one-paragraph review, with excerpts on picturesque, cutthroat, scenes featuring desperadoes and lawlessness, Empire 1857. A New Zealand newspaper gave a warm review with excerpts both of Panamanian Adventures and the Crimea Littleton Times 1857. The book reviews found were all favourable. Not one mentioned Seacole's lamentable blunders, her use of toxic substances or taking of trophies or plunder from dead soldiers or churches, which are frankly noted in her memoir, Seacole pp 31, 167 and 174. There is nothing in any of the reviews to demonstrate medical or nursing competence. Racial equality. Seacole is described as an African Jamaican several times, with an explicit statement that she respected her African Jamaican heritage, Starring Dirks et al. 2015, pp 51516. Yet her own memoir includes not one mention of Africa or African, and the references to her Creole heritage are negative, while those to her Scottish ancestry are positive. Seacole pp. 1-2. She was 3/4 white, had a white husband, white business partner and white clientele. She employed black people, including 2 servants who traveled with her, Seacole pp. 12, 36, 39, and 2 good-for-nothing black cooks in the Crimea, Seacole p. 141. Other examples of disparaging remarks are available, MacDonald 2014, pp. 1925. Seacole's memoir shows that she believed in racial equality and utterly rejected the white supremacy views of the Southern Americans she met in Panama. At the same time, however, she distanced herself from black people. In an admirable put-down of a prejudiced Southerner, she said that if her skin had been as dark as any ed, I should have been just as happy and as useful, Seacole p. 48. Clearly her skin was not as dark. For skin color for herself she preferred yellow, Seacole pp. 27, 34, 78-9, brunette or a little brown, Seacole p. 4. Further newspaper coverage of Seacole. Newspaper coverage of Seacole in the post-Crimea period continued, but was far less frequent than that for Nightingale and not at all of the same weight or on the same subjects. As before, stories show that she was well remembered, but are not on nursing or health care. One in a Scottish newspaper noted her being injured in an omnibus accident. When she got off she was instantly recognized by an officer and some of the Crimean heroes, who both offered their assistance and abused the driver for his carelessness, called Indian Mercury 1857. Her return to Jamaica from London in 1859 was noted on a passenger list, where she was listed as a passenger, with others, including 7 Sisters of Charity, The Times 1859. Staring Dirks, Staring and Onion Woo, however, interpreted this to suggest that she was accompanied by 7 Sisters of Charity, 2015, p. 521, when there was no indication of any connection in the original story. Another brief note recorded that Seacole, called the famous Crimean camp follower, was now living at Panama, Daily News 1862. An officer en route to Vancouver Island saw her at a hotel there. In this delightful locality we saw the sunny face of Mrs. Seacole, of Crimean renown, gadding about with naval officers on leave from the frigate Orlando, United Service Magazine 1863. These items show that Seacole was still known enough to be recalled with affection, but nothing more. At the same time, Nightingale was busy analyzing health data for India, Valley 2006, and extending her hospital analysis, Nightingale 1859, for publication as a major book, Notes on Hospitals, Nightingale 1863a. Seacole's return to England in the heights of the American Civil War of 1865 was noted, The Times 1865. She was seen at a Jamaica-related trial in London, the execution of George William Gordon and Paul Bogle in the Morant Bay Rebellion, The Times 1867a. On her death in 1881, there were substantial obituaries, notably and with numerous factual errors, in The Times, 1881a. There were shorter items on her will and associated legalities. Stories with substance on Seacole are few. The Surrey Gardens Festival received much coverage, but that was focused on the performances and the firm's later financial difficulties. It, too, went bankrupt. Her exchange with Lord Rokeby was published in The Times, but it is confined to her financial situation, Rokeby 1856. When a new fund was established for Seacole in England in 1867, again there were events in its support, both in England and the colonies, for example, a theatrical performance in London's Haymarket, The Times 1867c, and an amateur performance in Wellington, New Zealand, Wanagi Evening Herald 1867. None of this relates to nursing, in contrast with the fundraising done for the Nightingale Fund, which resulted in the establishment of the first nursing school in the world. In 1872, the founder of the International Red Cross, Henry Dunant, credited Nightingale with the inspiration for the Geneva Convention, The Times 1872a. She was decorated by both France and Prussia for her assistance during the Franco-Prussian War, MacDonald 2011, p. 822. Most of her work on the war was in support of the National Aid Society, the original Red Cross in the UK. When it decided not to send nurses, Nightingale's efforts were confined to the organization of medical assistance and, for the French, relief as famine resulted from the Prussian siege. Nightingale also gave what assistance she could to people acting independently of the Aid Society. The year 1872 marks also Nightingale's first work on establishing trained nursing in the United States, beginning with Bellevue Hospital, New York, McDonald 2009, pp. 499508. American nursing followed her model closely, but with little direct involvement of Nightingale herself. She corresponded to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the famous author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, on nurse training for the U.S., McDonald 2009, pp. 808. However, Stowe did not pursue the subject as it had all the trademarks blackness engraved in its origin. Still in 1872, she wrote in support of education for women in Germany, the Times 1872b, and advised on nursing in Hesse-Darmstadt, McDonald 2009, pp. 45360. The Grand Duchess of Hesse-Darmstadt was Princess Alice, another daughter of Queen Victoria keen to advance trained nursing. Now to show bias I will ask. When did Florence Nightingale become a nurse? And the earliest reference that came up was Works by Florence Nightingale. 1851. The Institution of Kaiserswerth on the Rhine, for the practical training of deaconesses, under the direction of the Reverend Pastor Fleidner, embracing the support and care of a hospital, infant and industrial schools, and a female penitentiary. London, Colonial Ragged Training School. Seacole's father was an officer in the British Army and originally from Scotland. Her mother was a free Jamaican whose patients knew her as doctress or medicine woman, skilled in traditional Jamaican medicine. She ran a boarding house for disabled sailors and soldiers and those suffering from yellow fever. As a young child, Seacole learned to read and write from her father and was an eager student of the healing arts, which she learned from her mother. By the time she was 12 years old, Seacole was helping her mother run the boarding house and care for the residents. Just 3 years later, at the age of 15, she traveled with relatives to England and stayed for 1 year. There, she learned more about European medicine to supplement her training in traditional Caribbean herbal medicine. This was the first of several trips she made throughout her life. In her autobiography, Seacole described her love of travel. As I grew into womanhood, I began to indulge that longing which will never leave me while I have health and vigor, she wrote. I was never weary of tracing upon an old map the route to England, and never followed with my gaze the stately ships homeward bound without longing to be in them, and see the blue hills of Jamaica fade into the distance. In her teens, she took 2 trips and spent 3 years in London before traveling to the Bahamas, Haiti, and Cuba. During her travels, she bought goods to sell when she returned to Kingston. In 1836, at 31 years of age, she married Edwin Horatio Hamilton Seacole, whom she described as the godson of Admiral Lord Nelson. She and her husband opened a supply store in Black River. During this time, Edwin became unwell, and the store did not do well. The couple moved back to her mother's boarding house, where Edwin died in 1844, just 8 years after their marriage. Seacole's mother died the same year. The deaths devastated Seacole, who then turned her focus and energy to traveling and nursing. Mary Seacole's pursuit of healing. Seacole has been described as a daring adventurer of the 19th century at a time in history when women, and particularly women of mixed race, faced many barriers when venturing into business or traveling independently. Cholera outbreak in Panama. After the death of her mother and husband, Seacole headed to Panama. She and her brother ran a hotel, and Seacole opened a store across the street. They catered to prospectors headed to the California gold rush who were crossing to avoid the dangerous journey around Cape Horn or the long overland journey. Panama had become a crossroads of interscenic travel and the fastest route to California. While in Panama, Seacole contracted a mild case of cholera during the massive outbreak that stopped work on the Panama Railroad. Seacole had experience with cholera as it had devastated her home in Kingston before she left for Panama. Cholera is spread through contaminated food and water. Panama had become both a place of economic opportunity and an area that suffered many deaths from cholera, yellow fever, and malaria. During her time in Panama, Seacole treated many patients with cholera, using commonly prescribed treatments by doctors at the time that are now known to be harmful. They included emetics to induce vomiting and mercury chloride, which is odorless, colorless, and extremely toxic. Mercury chloride is highly corrosive and later was used as a fungicide and rat poison. In her book, Seacole said there were blunders in treatment. Seacole was a popular doctress, and when she left Panama, she was given a farewell party. During one speech, a man lamented that Seacole's skin wasn't white as it would have made her more acceptable. Seacole did not allow the prejudice to be ignored and responded that her skin color made no difference to her work. She went on to say that even if her skin had been darker, she would have been respected by others whose respect she valued. This is an area where the story again starts to shift somewhat. Seacole journeys to Crimea. Seacole returned to Kingston in 1853, where she learned of the war being waged over Crimea, a strategic peninsula in the Black Sea. Seacole had become familiar with many British regiments while caring for officers and soldiers at her mother's boarding house. On her return to Kingston, she watched as many she knew left to fight in Crimea. Seacole returned to Panama to wind up her business and did some gold prospecting. By 1854 she traveled to England to attend to her unprofitable gold investments. It was there that she saw advertisements for hospital nurses to serve in Crimea. After a supply ship sunk in November, Seacole abandoned her gold speculation and focused on offering her skills to nurse the injured and sick in Crimea. She applied to the War Department in England. Despite glowing recommendations from officials who knew her work, she was told that all the positions had been filled. To make the intent clear, they also told her she would not be chosen even if a vacancy did open. Soldiers were dying in Crimea, not only from wounds but also from dysentery and cholera. Seacole believed her experience with these diseases would help the men who had become her friends. Undaunted, Seacole wrote a letter to Florence Nightingale to introduce herself, but one of Nightingale's assistants rejected her upon introduction. Since she was not allowed to join Nightingale in Turkey at the hospital, Seacole financed her own way to Crimea with a relative of her husband, Thomas Day. During their journey, they stayed the night in Skutrai, Turkey, at Florence Nightingale's hospital. How did she come by this hospital and when we may never know, but my search continues. The nursing legacy of Mary Jane Seacole. Seacole was bankrupt but received many praises from soldiers whom she had helped. The Mary Seacole Trust records the events that followed. The Times war correspondent, Sir William H. Russell, wrote of Mary in 1857, "I trust that England will not forget one who nursed her sick, who sought out her wounded to aid and succor them, and who performed the last offices for some of her illustrious dead." Over 80,000 people attended a 4-day fundraising gala in her honor. Yet, while well attended, the event raised very little money. Seacole again stepped away from what was expected and published an autobiography that same year entitled The Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands, which became an instant bestseller. A second Seacole fund was sponsored by Queen Victoria, the Duke of Edinburgh, and his brother, the future King Edward VII. This ensured a comfortable income for the remaining years of her life. Seacole died of a stroke on the 14th of May, 1881, at age 76, and was buried at Kensal Green Cemetery in London. The lasting impact of Mother Seacole. Seacole made a significant impact on the people she cared for and those who heard of her exploits throughout her business and nursing ventures. Seacole always considered herself a citizen of Britain, but it has been the Jamaican people who have kept her memory alive. On the 100th anniversary of the Crimean War, the Jamaican Nurses Association renamed its headquarters the Mary Seacole House. Her gravestone was restored in the early 1970s, and a ward at Kingston General Hospital was named after her. In 1990, Seacole was posthumously awarded the country's third highest honor, the Order of Merit. Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale were contemporaries who both contributed to the growth and development of nursing. Nightingale's strengths were organization and mathematical analysis of the data, while Seacole took a more hands-on approach. Some historians refer to her as the first nurse practitioner. Nursing has benefited from the positive attributes of both nurses as the profession has grown and expanded. Seacole worked hard to overcome racism by using her talent and skill, earning her a place as a powerful influence in nursing history. Despite racial discrimination and encountering resistance at nearly every turn, Seacole remained steadfast in her determination to serve the British soldiers. Her lasting legacy as a nurse, role model, entrepreneur, and high achiever has become the hallmark of nurses and nurse practitioners everywhere. Another similar story where knowledge has been stolen and credit not given of the same era is the wrought iron story which led to the Morant Bay Rebellion, where at least 82 foundry workers, white, mixed race and blacks, were executed and more than 700 others killed in the following days and their equipment sent off to England. The case of Gordon vs. follows. Subscribe and hit all to not miss it. Thanks for watching and leave your comments on any such other stories you know of.